So in today's society, which is very much focused on the physical, it's very easy to lose sight of the spiritual. And one really easy way to reignite that belief in the spiritual, in something beyond this physical reality, is to understand consciousness, and more specifically, the mystery of consciousness. I'm Georgia. I'm currently studying a master's degree in consciousness, spirituality, and transpersonal psychology. And in this video, I want to focus upon the hard problem of consciousness. When you understand this problem and the mystery it entails, it can really reshape your beliefs about reality, especially if it's something that you have never thought about before. So in this video, I'm going to talk to you about the hard problem of consciousness. I'm going to tell you the conventional view to solve this problem, and I'm going to propose to you an alternative that, if correct, really opens up the door for a completely new conception of reality. So the conventional view of consciousness is simple, and that is the view that the brain produces consciousness. Either consciousness is exactly the same, it is equal to the activity that is happening in the brain, they are the same thing, or it is an epiphenomenon of that activity happening in the brain. Either way, consciousness is boiled down to the brain. Now the problem is, this has actually never been proven. This is called the hard problem of consciousness. It is the problem of how on earth physical processes in the brain can give rise to consciousness, because at least from our experience, consciousness and physical matter seem so far apart, they seem so fundamentally different in quality. So no one has ever managed to answer the hard problem of consciousness. There's been many different attempts to create theories as to how the brain produces consciousness. Some of them even go right down to quantum physics and look at the quantum processes in the brain and try and use those to build a theory of how the brain produces consciousness. And yet none of them manage to answer the crucial question of how these physical processes can result in consciousness. Basically, consciousness remains a complete mystery, and if you can answer it, you'll probably win a Nobel Prize. So considering that no one has managed to prove that the brain produces consciousness, and that there is actually a lot of evidence that seems to contradict that view, which I'm not going to go into in this video, maybe in a separate video, but just know that there are a lot of phenomena which question this materialistic view that the brain produces consciousness. So with that in mind, I'm going to propose an alternative view. Now, of course, this is not my own theory, this is just one that I particularly resonate with. If you want to read more about these kind of ideas, then I would recommend reading Why Materialism is Baloney by Bernardo Kastrup. So instead of assuming that the brain produces consciousness, in this alternative theory, we're going to assume that the brain acts as a filter to consciousness. So for this theory, we can use an analogy of a TV set or a radio. That works equally well too, but I'll talk about a TV set for now. So in this analogy, the physical brain equals the physical TV set. The processes happening in the brain equal the processes happening within the TV set. So when I say the processes in the brain, they're what's called neural correlates of consciousness. So we have something in science called neural correlates of consciousness. These are the processes in the brain which correlate to different aspects of consciousness. Don't necessarily produce it, but they correlate to it. So these neural correlates of consciousness would equal the processes that are happening within the TV set which correlate to the different programs that are being played. And then, of course, we have consciousness itself, which in the analogy, of course, equals the programs that we are seeing. The TV shows, the movies, whatever it is that you're watching on TV. So if you think about a TV and you watching programs on TV, we all know that the TV itself does not produce those programs. Those programs were already produced and a TV simply tunes into them. So this means that neither the physical TV set itself or the processes happening within the TV actually create that TV program. All that physical set does and the processes happening within it allow us to tune into those programs. Now the same might be true of consciousness. Perhaps the brain doesn't produce consciousness, perhaps instead the physical brain and the processes happening within it allow us to tune into consciousness. Perhaps the brain is filtering consciousness. So in this analogy, we might assume that there is something like cosmic consciousness, basically that consciousness exists everywhere, and our individual consciousness, we only experience it like that simply because our brain is filtering it. So our individual consciousness is just a little bit of the total consciousness that we are tuned into by virtue of our brain and the processes happening in our brain. So basically the key takeaway of this analogy is that the TV doesn't produce the programs, and similarly, for all we know, the brain doesn't actually produce consciousness. Now, one really interesting set of evidence that materialists like to use to try and confirm this theory that the brain produces consciousness is the idea of brain damage. So obviously when people experience brain damage, they experience various cognitive impairments. And so materialists will use that as evidence that because the brain is damaged and then people are having impairments to their consciousness, then that must mean that the brain produces consciousness. But let's go back to the TV analogy for a second. If certain elements or mechanisms within the TV are broken or impaired in some way, then this might lead to a distortion of the images that we're seeing on the TV. That's not surprising at all, and yet that still doesn't mean that that physical TV set and the processes happening within it produce those programs. Those programs are still already produced, and the impairments that are happening to the TV distort the images because they affect the ability to tune into those programs. So when we apply this to consciousness, perhaps the same thing is happening with brain damage. When the brain is damaged in some way, it's leading to these cognitive impairments, not because the brain produces consciousness, but because the impairment to these processes within the brain affects the brain's ability to tune into consciousness, to filter consciousness. So the fact that brain damage leads to various cognitive impairments does not prove that the brain produces consciousness. All it does is prove that the brain is somehow linked to consciousness, which is obvious. It's the nature of that relationship that is still under question. Now, leading away from this TV analogy slightly, I want to talk about another phenomenon which kind of really feeds into this idea of the brain being a filter to consciousness. And this is the fact that there are certain conscious experiences, quite elaborate conscious experiences, which actually, when happening, show a reduction in brain activity. Now, two examples of this are when people are on psychedelics. Another one is near-death experiences. Now, if we take the assumption that the brain produces consciousness, in that scenario, what we would assume is that brain activity has to correlate to conscious experience. There should be some proportionality there. So the more conscious experience you're having, you'd expect there to be more brain activity. The less of a conscious experience you're having, you'd expect there to be less brain activity. However, these two examples show that this actually isn't the case. There have been studies done on people with psychedelics which actually show that they have less brain activity going on, despite having these really elaborate conscious experiences and visions. And the same with near-death experiences. These are a really extreme example. If you've ever looked into near-death experiences, you know that people have these really amazing transpersonal experiences even when there is no detectable brain activity. Now, this is very difficult to explain under the assumption that the brain produces consciousness, simply because you would expect the amount of activity going on to correlate to the conscious experience that is being had, which it doesn't seem to do in these cases. However, if we assume that the brain is a filter to consciousness, then perhaps this lower brain activity is actually letting more consciousness pass through. Perhaps it has to do with this filtering mechanism of the brain. If the brain actually filters consciousness, so all the processes going on in the brain are filtering consciousness in a particular way, and then we take those processes away, we have lower brain activity, then the filtering mechanism perhaps stops, so maybe we have more consciousness come through. Now, I obviously can't prove to you that that is the case, but it certainly makes some logical sense. So it's just another thing to keep in mind about this idea of the brain perhaps being a filter to consciousness. Now, if this idea of the brain being a filter to consciousness rather than producing it is true, then it has a really amazing implication. And this is the implication of life after death. Because if we assume that the brain produces consciousness, then when we die, when our brain dies, then that would mean that we would have no consciousness because the thing producing it is no longer working. However, if the brain is simply a filter to consciousness, then this opens up the possibility of consciousness surviving bodily death. So that's another reason that I love the filter hypothesis, partly because it just makes so much more sense to me, and secondly, because obviously the thought of life after death is pretty comforting, and also just fascinating that that actually could be a plausible possibility. So that is all that I want to touch upon in this video. I hope this whole mystery of consciousness gave you some things to think about and hopefully opened your mind up to some other conceptions of reality if you weren't already open to them. So thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you in the next one.